Welcome to part 2 of our lesson. I hope after you finished part 1, if you hadn't already done so, you went back and looked at all the video links. They will be important to helping you understand this topic. Let's continue. In cities, dozens of regulations existed to ensure recipients were morally worthy. This reflected long-standing beliefs that the poor were responsible for their own misery. Councils adopted the view that the unemployed couldn't budget for themselves. Most municipalities gave vouchers for food and rent to married men, usually with strict rules about what food could be purchased. Single men, if they were deemed eligible at all, were usually required to use their vouchers to get food in communal soup kitchens and shelter in hostels, which is what you can see pictured on this slide. While the lives of all unemployed people were grim, gender and race determined how grim, and Shrigley makes a similar point on page 89 of this week's reading. At various times in 1933, the city provided milk to married women with babies, relief for sick single women, medical care for pregnant women, and clothing allowances for married women and their children. Asian and Black Canadians were more likely to be denied relief. I'd like you to write this down, please. In BC, the relief rates for Asian recipients were set at half the rate for Caucasians. In BC, the relief rates for Asian recipients were set at half the rate for Caucasians. In Calgary, only a spirited campaign by the Communist Party resulted in the city's destitute Chinese citizens becoming eligible for social assistance. As the Depression got worse, municipalities made their eligibility rules increasingly stringent. I'd like you to write this down, please. Most disqualified single men from relief by 1931. Most disqualified single men from relief by 1931. Many young single men who formerly worked in mines and logging camps suddenly migrated to cities where their increasingly vocal frustration raised social fears and tensions. Since the bulk of the unemployed were, as the Minister of Labor put it at the time, quote, of alien origin and communist sympathies, the first priority was to get them out of the cities. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett's solution to this problem was to establish relief camps along the route of the proposed Trans-Canada Highway, where single men were provided with minimal wages in return for maximum work. This solution, as it was directed at men only. At the relief camps, perhaps better thought of as work camps, the government got men to do the unskilled manual labor needed to build highways, airports, and parks. Relief camps provided work at $2 a day. I'd like you to write this down. But more than half was kept back to pay for food and lodging. But more than half was kept back to pay for food and lodging. $2 a day was the average income of laborers at the turn of the century, 30 years prior. Relief programs were administered by the Department of National Defense. This gives you another clue about the intentions of the government. This wasn't just social assistance or public charity. It was also to maintain law and order. They were run like military barracks. They were full of rules and they had punishments for any violation. Relief camps didn't exactly work as the federal government hoped. Optimistically, they thought that those talking revolution would somehow be appeased by working for $1 a day doing highway construction work. In fact, relief camps proved fertile ground for union and political organizers. The most notable protest occurred in April of 1935. The On to Ottawa trek began as a demonstration in Vancouver, but then took to the rails when it was decided to bring the protest to Ottawa. And there's a 25-minute radio documentary in the first link if you're interested, but it's not mandatory for you to listen to. As they traveled, their ranks swelled with men until the government put an end to it in Regina when protesters and the RCMP clashed. I would like you to watch that clip, but be warned, it starts with a really loud train whistle. In that clash, one policeman died, several were injured, and hundreds of trekkers were arrested. As the Depression wore on, the social composition of the poor changed. It wasn't just rough loggers or miners or factory workers. It was now respectable working and middle class men and women who also felt the effects of unemployment. What also intensified were tactics by the RCMP to undermine social protest, including surveillance of political meetings, arrests of labor activists, violent confrontations with protesters, and the deportation of suspected radicals. Photographs, newsreels, movies, novels, and documentaries help us visualize the era. And I'd like you to pause right now and take a look at the clip that's called Visualize. Typically, we see men lined up at soup kitchens, riding railroads back and forth in search of work, engaged in menial public works projects in return for miserable wages, or we often see poor children looking hungry and dirty. Which begs the question, where are the women? The fact that we do not have as many haunting images of women from the 1930s reflects the basic situation of the times. The plight of women as unemployed workers was simply not on many people's minds. People were much more worried about male unemployment. After all, men were the workers, the breadwinners. They were the ones responsible for the family income. So unemployment was naturally constructed as a male phenomenon, which affected the entire family. Working women sometimes faced hostility. The assumption or accusation was that women were stealing jobs from men. And I think your reading does a really good job at debunking this myth, especially on pages 72 to 73. Women were accused of being selfish or working simply for pin money. It's called pin money because in the late 1880s, 1890s, women used to need really long pins to secure their hats into their hair so they wouldn't move around. I'd like you to write this down. The underlying concern was that men were thought to be emasculated by this process. The underlying concern was that men were thought to be emasculated by this process. Children took on more responsibilities, sometimes finding work when parents could not, adding to their parents' guilt or feelings of inadequacy. Now, the video clip that's titled Children is excellent. It does oral histories with senior citizens who were children during the Great Depression. And while I don't think it's necessary for you to watch all 27 minutes, I would like you to kind of dip in and out of it. Female unemployment wasn't given much thought. But in reality, women joined the workforce in ever greater numbers. In 1921 in Canada, close to 18% of women worked for pay. In 1931, the figure was 19.4%, and in 1941, 23%. There was also an increase in married women's participation from 7 to 10%. Previously, federal and provincial civil service policies forced women to retire from work when they got married. But in Ontario, many women worked to support ill or unemployed husbands, or their families if their husbands deserted them. Some women kept their maiden names at work to keep their marriages a secret, though they were supposed to report changes in marital status. So were they really stealing men's jobs? No. Labor forces were gender segregated, and Shrigley makes this point very well on pages 71 and 92 of your reading. Women made up 95% of stenographers, 96% of housekeepers, and 100% of nurses. These were jobs men were not interested in or would not do. Historians point out there was a clear racial pattern in women's employment in this era. In the US, Black women had traditionally been part of the paid labor force in much larger numbers than white women. During the Great Depression, Black women were either further down the rungs of the job hierarchy or pushed out of paid labor force altogether. In 1930, 50% of Black Americans were unemployed. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, however, was a champion of Black rights, and New Deal programs prohibited discrimination. I would like you to pause this presentation and watch the primary source and piece of propaganda, We Will Work Again, from 1937. In Canada, oral history interviews suggest Black women didn't experience the same economic devastation as white workers because they were already at the bottom in terms of their prospects. And Shrigley makes this point on page 82 and 86 of your reading. Most Black women in Ontario worked as domestic servants, about 80% in Toronto. They were further exploited by reduced wages, but there were not massive layoffs. Regardless, women became scapegoats for male unemployment frustration. During the Depression, thousands of Canadians wrote directly to the government, and especially to government leaders, asking for help and legislation to create an unemployment insurance scheme. The collection was eventually published under the title The Wretched of Canada. And this link above takes you to a brief newspaper article that talks about these letters. These letters give a real sense of the harsh circumstances many experienced and speak to the relationship between work and one's sense of personal pride. I'd like you to write this down, please. Men appealed to their war records, breadwinner status, and rights as good Canadian citizens. Letters reveal some men didn't think women needed work or even deserved to work. Men appealed to war records, breadwinner status, and their rights as good Canadian citizens. Letters reveal some men didn't think women needed work or even deserved to work. And I'll give you an example, and you can see part of this letter on the slide. In 1934, a veteran wrote to Prime Minister Bennett, "Men have served their country in war, and now we walk and walk to ask for work, but none is to be had. While the women who powder their noses and waste their time talking nonsense take our jobs. There are women's jobs by the score in newspapers, and not a single job for a man. Women always spend their money on shows. Some have sugar daddies to take them out at night. It's not fair. And if this is not regulated, there will be a revolution. Now, this may just be the angry mutterings of one man, but his suggestion that the problem of unemployed women be regulated was taken quite seriously. The U.S. federal government passed legislation in 1932 requiring civil service cuts to target personnel whose spouses also worked for the government. Please write this down. It didn't specify whether the fired person was male or female, but the intent was clearly to remove wives. Within a year, 1,600 female civil servants in the U.S. lost their jobs. It didn't specify whether the fired person was male or female, but the intent was clearly to remove wives. Within a year, 1,600 female civil servants in the U.S. lost their jobs. Now, no such laws were passed in Canada, but there was popular support for the expulsion of women from the labor force. This was expressed in letters to the government and letters to editors and newspapers, and it was also expressed within newspaper editorials themselves. In Quebec, the government proposed a bill to forbid employment of women in offices and industries unless she proved she had no other source of financial support. As one Quebec politician put it, quote, "The idea of legislating women out of industry so out-of-work men may get their jobs may be fantastic, but there is a considerable element of good old-fashioned common sense in it during these troublesome days." End quote. Actually, the politician went on to say, "There is a new patriotic call for women to step down in favor of the million or so men in Canada who are out of work. Wouldn't national life be happier, saner, and safer if these men could be given the work, even if it meant women would have to sacrifice their financial independence and go home to be supported by their father, husband, or brother as they were in the old pre-feminist days." And one example is in the newspaper article pictured here, where an art professor who was found to be married had to give up her job. Although this bill was introduced and debated, it didn't pass. It failed by a vote of 47 to 16. But even though there was no law officially forbidding female employment, it didn't stop individual employers from giving in to these social prejudices. Governments gave tacit approval for this kind of discrimination through their own prejudiced employment practices. Many municipal school boards fired female school teachers upon marriage, or simply didn't hire married women. And Scrigley writes about this on page 88 and pages 100 to 101. The Federal Civil Service made it their explicit policy not to hire married women. In a widely publicized case in 1936, Ontario's premier fired 6 women, all provincial civil servants, who had concealed their marital status, proclaiming, quote, "We take the position that if a woman is married, her husband should keep her," end quote. If employers did fire women and hire men in their place, it wasn't necessarily out of an altruistic compassion for the plight of men and families, or even because they were prejudiced against women. As we all know, a strategy for coping with economic downturn is layoffs or wage reductions. In the 1930s, the wages of women workers were protected by minimum wage laws, which had been passed by most provinces back in the 1920s. It is one of the legacy of the first wave suffrage movement. So there was a limit beyond which employers could cut women's wages. And I'd like you to write this down. But there was no legal minimum wage for male workers. There was no legal minimum wage for male workers. In other words, in a strange reversal of the usual scenario, women lost their jobs because men worked for less. When you consider that women's wages were historically at least 40% lower than men's, you realize how bleak the Great Depression must have been. Clerical and service fields were less severely hit by unemployment, occupations traditionally dominated by women. In Canada, 84% of female wage earners were clustered into three main occupational groups: clerical, the service sector, and manufacturing. Domestic servants continued to be in demand, which provided women with an employment safety net that men just didn't have. Domestic service was the one profession for women which increased during the 1930s. In the early 1930s, women's jobs in manufacturing declined by 6%, whereas the openings for women in domestic service increased 7%. Sexual segregation within the labor force make the claim that women took away men's jobs quite irrational and ill-formed, but the rhetoric remained persistent. Historians argue this backlash against female workers reveals that the combination of severe poverty and prolonged unemployment fostered a crisis of masculinity.